February 19, 1943, witnessed the beginning of a humiliation that nearly broke the American spirit during World War II, when General George S. Patton and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel faced a shifting tide in Tunisia. The stinging defeat at Kasserine Pass left the U.S. Second Corps shattered, questioning their own survival against the veteran German panzers. How did a force defined by chaos and retreat transform into a disciplined machine that eventually terrified the Desert Fox himself? The North African desert was never a place for the weak, yet in early 1943, the American Army appeared to be exactly that. Under the command of Major General Lloyd Fredendall, the soldiers of the Second Corps were scattered, poorly positioned, and suffering from a profound lack of direction. Fredendall himself was miles behind the front lines, literally digging a bunker for his own safety while his men were being torn apart by the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions. The Battle of Kasserine Pass was not merely a tactical defeat. It was a psychological collapse that led Erwin Rommel to believe the Americans were little more than unorganized amateurs who lacked the stomach for the brutal reality of mechanized warfare. Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, watched through his binoculars as American M3 Lee tanks were picked off with surgical precision by German 88mm flak guns. To Rommel, the Americans were technically proficient, but lacked the soldierly soul required to win. He noted in his personal diaries, later recovered by Allied intelligence, that the Americans fled at the first sign of a concentrated German thrust, leaving behind mountains of equipment that the cash-strapped Africa Corps desperately needed. The German High Command viewed the American presence in Africa as a minor nuisance rather than a legitimate threat to their hegemony in the Mediterranean. The disaster at Kasserine sent shockwaves all the way to General Dwight D. Eisenhower's headquarters. Eisenhower knew that if the Americans did not find a leader capable of instilling fear and pride in equal measure, the entire North African campaign would fail. On March 6, 1943, a sleek, open-top command car arrived at the Second Corps headquarters in Jebel Quif. Out stepped a man wearing highly polished cavalry boots, a shining helmet, and two ivory-handled revolvers strapped to his waist. General George S. Patton Jr. had arrived, and the atmosphere of the camp changed in a heartbeat. Patton's first act was not a tactical briefing or a review of the maps, but a declaration of total war against sloppiness. He looked at the ragged, exhausted soldiers of the 1st Armored Division and saw men who had forgotten they were warriors. Patton believed that a man who could not keep his uniform clean could not be trusted to keep his rifle clean, and a man who could not keep his rifle clean would eventually cost the lives of his comrades in the heat of battle. He immediately instituted a series of draconian regulations that became known among the troops as the Necktie War. Every soldier, from the frontline infantryman to the cook in the rear, was ordered to wear neckties, leggings, and polished helmets at all times, even in the blistering heat of the Tunisian sun. Fines were issued for the smallest infractions, and Patton himself would roam the lines in his Jeep, looking for any sign of a slacker. While many soldiers cursed his name, calling him old blood and guts with a sneer, the psychological impact was immediate. The men stopped seeing themselves as victims of Rommel's brilliance and began seeing themselves as members of a professional, elite organization that demanded perfection. Patton's methodology was grounded in a deep understanding of military history and the works of Clausewitz and Sun Tzu. He understood that discipline was the only antidote to the paralyzing fear caused by German Stuka dive bombers. By forcing the men to focus on the minutiae of their appearance and their daily routines, he redirected their nervous energy into a structured discipline. This was the birth of the Patton style, a blend of theatrical bravado and uncompromising standards that signaled to every man in the Second Corps that the era of retreating was over. The transformation was not limited to dress codes. Patton overhauled the entire command structure of the Second Corps, sacking officers who showed hesitation and promoting those who demonstrated an aggressive spirit. He integrated the 1st Infantry Division, the famed Big Red One, and the 9th Infantry Division into a cohesive hammer. He spent hours reviewing the after-action reports from Kasserine, identifying the exact moments where American artillery had failed to support the armor. Patton demanded that his artillery commanders be able to bring down a curtain of fire within minutes of a request, a technical feat that would soon haunt the German infantry. Primary sources from the 1st Armored Division's war diaries indicate that during this period, training exercises became more lethal and realistic. Patton insisted on live fire drills, forcing his men to crawl under machine gun fire to desensitize them to the sounds of the battlefield. He was building a force that would not only endure Rommel's maneuvers, but would eventually seek them out. The soldiers began to walk with a different gait. The slumped shoulders of the Kasserine defeat were replaced by the rigid posture of men who knew they were being watched by a commander who expected nothing less than victory. As the Second Corps sharpened its blade, the German intelligence services began to report a strange shift in American behavior. Reports reached Rommel's desk of American patrols that no longer retreated when engaged, but instead counterattacked with a ferocity that seemed unnatural for amateurs. Rommel, struggling with health issues and a chronic lack of supplies from Berlin, began to wonder if he had misjudged the American character. He knew that the vast industrial power of the United States was starting to pour into the port of Casablanca, but it was the sudden professionalization of the men on the ground that truly concerned him. The strategic landscape of Tunisia was a maze of jagged ridges and narrow passes, terrain that favored the defender. Rommel had used this to his advantage for years, but Patton was preparing a new kind of warfare. He envisioned a highly mobile, combined arms approach where M4 Sherman tanks and M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers moved in a violent symphony of destruction. Patton's doctrine was simple: hold them by the nose and kick them in the pants. He wanted to fix the Germans in place with infantry and artillery, while his armor swung around the flanks to crush their supply lines. In mid-March, the order finally came for the Second Corps to move toward the heights of Guettar. This was to be the ultimate test of Patton's discipline. The men moved out in perfect columns, their equipment secured, their spirits high. There was no chatter, no chaos. There was only the steady rumble of engines and the rhythmic clinking of treads. The Americans were no longer a rabble. They were a professional army marching into the jaws of the most experienced armored force in the world. Rommel, sensing the impending storm, prepared his defenses. He placed the 10th Panzer Division on the high ground, confident that their superior training and the formidable Panzer IV tanks would once again scatter the Americans. But Rommel was no longer facing Fredendall. He was facing a man who studied his own book, Infantry Attacks, and who was determined to out-Rommel the Desert Fox. The stage was set for a collision that would define the American role in World War II. The opening salvos of the Battle of Guettar were a revelation. Instead of the sporadic and inaccurate fire the Germans expected, they were met with a terrifyingly precise American artillery barrage. Patton had spent weeks ensuring his observers and gunners were in perfect sync. The German infantry, caught in the open, found themselves pinned down by a level of firepower they had rarely experienced even on the Eastern Front. This was the Patton effect in its purest form. Discipline translated into destructive efficiency. Patton watched the battle from a forward observation post, his binoculars fixed on the horizon. He saw his tanks moving in disciplined formations, utilizing the terrain just as he had drilled them. When a junior officer expressed concern about the mounting casualties, Patton reportedly snapped that wars are not won by dying for your country, but by making the other poor dumb bastard die for his. This ruthless pragmatism was exactly what the Second Corps needed to overcome the psychological shadow of the Wehrmacht. As the first part of the battle drew to a close, the German commanders realized that the Americans they were fighting at Guettar were not the same men they had chased through Kasserine Pass only weeks prior. The discipline was there. The aggression was there. And most importantly, the leadership was there. Rommel's tactical expectations had been shattered, and for the first time in the North African campaign, the Desert Fox felt a genuine sense of dread about the future of his command. The morning of March 23, 1943, dawned with a cold, biting wind that swept across the plains of Guettar, carrying the scent of diesel and cordite. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's subordinates, specifically General von Arnim, launched the 10th Panzer Division into what they believed would be a decisive counterstroke. They expected the Americans to fold under the pressure of a coordinated tank assault. But Patton had anticipated this. He had positioned his tank destroyers and anti-tank guns in a V formation, creating a kill zone that was designed to swallow the panzers whole. As the German tanks emerged from the morning mist, they were met with a wall of fire. The American M375mm guns, though outclassed in range by the German long 75s, were being manned by crews who had been drilled to the point of exhaustion by Patton's regime. Every loader and gunner knew their role with mechanical precision. The 10th Panzer Division, once the pride of the German army, found itself losing tanks at an alarming rate. The discipline Patton had enforced, the relentless focus on the basics, was paying dividends in the lives of his men and the wreckage of German armor. Rommel's tactical genius relied on the fingertip feeling, Fingerspitzengefühl, the ability to sense the ebb and flow of battle and strike at the point of greatest weakness. However, Patton's rigid enforcement of discipline had removed those weaknesses. There were no longer gaps in the lines for Rommel to exploit. There were no panicked retreats that his motorized units could capitalize on. Patton had effectively created a solid front, a tactical reality that negated the mobile advantages of the Afrika Korps. Throughout the afternoon, the Germans launched wave after wave of attacks, but the Second Corps held firm. Patton was seen moving among the frontline positions, his presence a living embodiment of the resolve he demanded from his troops. He didn't just order his men to be brave, he modeled that bravery, often standing in full view of enemy fire to show his soldiers that the German boogeyman could be beaten. This personal leadership, combined with the structural changes he implemented, created a feedback loop of confidence that surged through the American ranks. In the German command bunkers, the mood was darkening. Intercepted radio transmissions showed that the German officers were confused by the American tenacity. One declassified report from the 10th Panzer Division noted, "The enemy shows a newfound tactical maturity and an aggressive spirit that was entirely absent in previous engagements." Rommel himself, though physically absent from the front lines due to his declining health and eventual recall, received reports that painted a grim picture. The amateurs had grown up, and they had grown up under the shadow of a man who was every bit as ruthless as any Prussian general. Patton's transformation of the Second Corps was not just about the Battle of Guettar. It was about the preparation for the invasion of Sicily and eventually Fortress Europe. He was building the Big Red One and the First Armored into the shock troops of the Western Allies. He emphasized the importance of the march order, the ability of a unit to pack up and move at a moment's notice. This operational mobility was key to Patton's strategy of relentless pursuit. He knew that once the German lines broke, he had to be ready to exploit the gap before they could regroup. The logistics of Patton's command were equally impressive. He worked tirelessly to ensure that his Necktie War extended to the supply lines. He demanded that fuel trucks and ammunition convoys move with the same discipline as the infantry. This ensured that when the Second Corps hit the Germans, they hit them with the full weight of American industrial output. A Sherman tank was useless without fuel, and a 105mm howitzer was silent without shells. Patton's discipline ensured the teeth of the army always had the bite to match. As April approached, the German position in North Africa became untenable. The Allied pincer movement, with Montgomery's 8th Army pushing from the east and Patton's Second Corps from the west, was crushing the Afrika Korps. Rommel's once superior mobile warfare strategies were being neutralized by a force that could outproduce, outshoot, and now outdiscipline his veterans. The psychological shift was complete. The Americans no longer feared the Germans began to fear the Americans. Direct quotes from Patton's diaries during this time reveal a man who was obsessed with the historical weight of his mission. He wrote about the ghosts of Carthage and believed he had fought on these same battlefields in past lives. This sense of destiny fueled his demand for perfection. He told his staff, "We are not here to occupy Tunisia. We are here to destroy the German army." The singular focus on the destruction of the enemy's will to fight was the hallmark of his command. The final collapse of the Axis forces in Africa in May 1943 was a testament to the foundation Patton had laid in the weeks after Kasserine. While he was eventually moved to command the 7th Army for the invasion of Sicily, the Second Corps remained a transformed entity. The men who had survived the Necktie War became the backbone of the American ground war in Europe. They carried Patton's lessons of discipline, aggression, and professional pride from the deserts of Tunisia to the forests of the Ardennes. Historians often debate whether Patton's focus on uniforms and saluting was necessary. Some argue it was mere ego, while others, looking at the performance of the Second Corps, argue it was the essential catalyst for change. When we examine the archival data and the sharp decrease in combat exhaustion cases following Patton's arrival, the evidence leans toward the latter. Discipline gave the men a structure to cling to when the world around them was exploding. It turned a collection of individuals into a singular, lethal organism. Rommel's respect for Patton, though often expressed through the lens of a professional rival, was genuine. After the war, German generals like Hans-Jürgen von Arnim admitted that the Patton shift was the moment they realized the war in Africa was lost. They had relied on American incompetence to balance the scales of their own dwindling resources. Once Patton removed that incompetence from the equation, the German defeat became a mathematical certainty. The legacy of Patton at Guettar remains one of the most significant leadership case studies in military history. It demonstrates that the soul of an army is not found in its weapons, but in its discipline. A soldier who believes in himself, his unit, and his commander is a force that no amount of technological superiority can easily overcome. Patton proved that the Americans were not just industrial giants, but martial ones as well. As we look back at the dusty ridges of Tunisia, we see more than just a battlefield. We see the forge where the modern U.S. Army was shaped. The Necktie War may have seemed absurd to the men in the foxholes, but it was the price of their transformation. It was the moment the American soldier stopped being a citizen in uniform and started being a warrior. The Desert Fox had met his match, not in a better tank, but in a better leader. The enigma of Patton remains. Was he a visionary who understood the human heart, or a tyrant who got lucky? One thing is certain: when the Second Corps marched through the streets of Tunis in victory, they did so with their boots polished, their ties straight, and their heads held high. They were the men who had looked into the eyes of the Desert Fox and refused to blink. The question of Patton's true nature may never be fully resolved, but his results are written in the history of a free world. Do you believe Patton's strict enforcement of dress codes and discipline was the primary reason for the Second Corps' success? Or was it simply the overwhelming industrial power of the United States that eventually broke Rommel? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.